Welcome to our parent training, understanding how children use their senses to regulate for learning and play, the role of sensory processing. This training was written by the Children's Occupational Therapy team in Cardiff and Vale University Health Board. You've been sent this online training to help you understand the experiences your child is having and give you ideas to help your child. My name is Sarah and I'm the occupational therapist who will be taking you through this training today. The aim of this training is to give you a basic understanding of sensory processing and how it may affect your child or young person. This training won't necessarily answer all of your questions, but will hopefully give you a place to start looking at how you can best support your child or young person. For ease, I will use the term child throughout this training to refer to all children and young people regardless of age. Please take your time going through this training and feel free to pause or rewind as needed. At times, I will ask you to pause and answer some questions for your own learning, so you may wish to grab a pen and some paper now. In this training, we aim to give you an understanding of what typical sensory processing looks like for everyone. To help you understand what sensory processing difficulties might look like for your child. And finally, share some ideas and strategies to support engagement and participation in daily activities for a child with sensory processing difficulties. Before we take a closer look at sensory processing, I'm going to take a few moments to explain what an occupational therapist is and how we support children and families like yourselves to achieve the things you want to and live life your way. Firstly, we are child-centred. We focus on what matters to the child and their family. Then, as the name suggests, we are concerned with occupations. Put simply, an occupation is anything a person does day to day, such as work, play and eating. We seek to enable engagement, participation and independence in those occupations by supporting performance. You can think of engagement, participation and independence as a continuum that you progress through. When a baby is young, we hope that they are interested and engaged when something happens to them. Then, as the child develops, we would expect the child to participate and join in part of the task. As they develop and grow further, they start to become independent and complete the task themselves without help. It's important to remember that independence with an occupation depends on each child's age and their development. It is vital that we are realistic in our expectations of what a child can achieve and when a child might need help or a task should be adapted. These factors all add to the child's success in occupational performance. For some children, it may not be realistic to expect independence, and we should then be aiming to encourage their engagement and participation instead. Occupational performance is the interaction between a child in their environment doing a task or occupation. This is a model adapted from Mary Law's work in 1996. I will explain this model to help you understand why we consider these areas when trying to support a child's occupational performance. Within the child section, we address the innate developmental features of the individual, considering their physical and psychosocial makeup, simply how the body moves and works, and how the child emotionally responds to success. Within the environment section, we consider the places they live, play and develop in, and the people in those environments, mums, dads and teachers for instance. We then split the occupation section into 3 parts. The task the child needs to do, known as self-care. This includes tasks such as dressing, eating and washing. Then what they have to do, known as productivity, which for a child is often school. Finally, what they want to do, known as leisure, which could be playing a sport or going to the park. As occupational therapists, we use our understanding of occupations to support development of meaningful roles and routines. We all have something to contribute to a task, be it the decision maker or the person that does the task. And, innate in us all, is the need for predictability which routines provide. We encourage and support opportunities that are suitable for your child's age and abilities in order to ensure that they have a balanced lifestyle and a range of meaningful occupations. Enabling age and developmentally appropriate opportunities ensures that we avoid occupational deprivation, that children don't miss out on participating in day-to-day experiences, and that we ensure a balanced lifestyle. After all, we would all like to spend our time doing what we want to do, but it's important that we also do what we have to and need to, that we have a balance of occupations and a number of different roles to play. Introduction to sensory processing. So, how does sensory processing fit into this? Sensory processing is one of the innate developmental features of us all. It falls into the person or child section of the model that I just described. We are all sensory beings, and sensory processing is the process of taking in all the sensory input around us, making sense of it, working out what's important, and responding to it. Sensory processing is a typical process. We all do it all of the time. It starts in very early development before birth and goes on into adulthood. We know that babies in the womb respond to the sound of their mother's voice. The way that a baby responds to and processes sensory information is different to an adult because our processing changes with age. We all process sensory information slightly differently, however. Have a think about yourself, your family, and your friends. Can you think of someone who always has their sunglasses on at the first sign of sun? Someone who hates the feeling of fairground rides? Someone who dislikes hugs? All these differences are typical and generally not a problem. Many children have differences in the way they process sensory information, but in some situations this becomes a problem and affects their ability to do what they need to, want to, and have to do in a day. It impacts on their occupational performance. That's where we need to do something different to help. Sensory processing difficulties are often seen in children with a neurodevelopmental diagnosis, such as autism or attention deficit disorder. However, difficulties are also seen in the absence of any diagnosis. How many senses do you think we have? Write down all the senses you can think of. You may have written down 5 or maybe 6, but the answer is actually 8. We have the 5 external senses that you are familiar with: touch, taste, smell, hearing, and vision. But we also have 3 internal senses, which are proprioception, vestibular, and interoception. Proprioception is our sense of where our body is in space and where it is in relation to the world around us. Vestibular is our sense of movement, including the position of our head. Interoception is our internal sense that tells us about our organs, for example when we are hungry, when we need the bathroom, and when we are hot or cold. Each of these 8 senses receive sensory information through receptors in various places in our bodies. These receptors then send that information to our brain for it to be understood and responded to. This can happen consciously, where we use our experience to think about and make a response, but it can also happen automatically, helping us avoid harm or injury. Take a minute to think about where the receptors might be for our different senses. The receptors for our 5 external senses are fairly straightforward. For example, the receptors for our sense of smell are in our nose. It's important to note here that our sense of touch is received through 2 pathways, one protective and one discriminative. Each deal with a different quality of touch. The protective pathway is concerned with pain and light touch. It helps us to respond to touch that may be painful or harmful, like when you lean on a hot surface or stand on a pin. The discriminative pathway responds to deep, firm touch and is closely linked with the proprioceptive sense. This helps us to understand what is touching our skin and where. The 3 internal senses are a little more complex. The vestibular system tells us about how our head is moving, so the receptors are in the inner ear. This system is activated by movement of our head, either in a straight line back and forth, or rotation. It is important to note that we can think about vestibular sensory information in 2 different ways. Linear is when our head moves back and forth, from side to side, or up and down. Rotational is when our head is rotated around. It also helps us to understand the position of our head in relation to the rest of our body. The receptors for our proprioceptive sense are located in our muscles and joints. and are therefore activated when we use our bodies to push, pull, lift and resist. Proprioception has a calming and organising effect on the body and brain, and is closely linked with the deep touch pathway that we talked about earlier. The receptors for our interoception sense are in our organs, such as our stomach, bladder and our skin, helping us understand how we feel and ensuring we get some of our basic needs met, such as hunger and thirst. So which of these different types of sensory input are the most calming? The answer is proprioception, deep touch, and linear vestibular input. Activities that provide these types of sensory input are generally calming and regulating for our bodies and nervous system. Deep touch can be things such as a cuddle or big bear hugs, massage or rolling up in a duvet like a hot dog. Linear vestibular can be going on a swing, going on a scooter, or sitting in a rocking chair. Proprioception could be climbing, swinging on monkey bars, or doing press-ups. In recap, all those receptors receive sensory information 24 hours a day, 7 days a week throughout our lives. This information is then processed by our brains, and there is an output reaction by our bodies or a behaviour. For individuals with sensory processing difficulties, we often see a difference in their behaviour or how they carry out a task, and this makes us look closer at what is happening when the child receives sensory information to see if we can help. Sensory processing underpins what we do and how we interact with the world. A good analogy for this is a house. When building a house, you need a good foundation to build on. You don't start building it from the top. Sensory processing is the foundation layer of bricks. We need a good foundation to build upon to achieve success. As you can see in the rest of the house, we need a good sensory foundation to develop our balance and motor planning, which in turn allows us to engage in activities. We can then develop our fine and gross motor skills, concentration and problem solving. These skills and the others listed in the house then support academic learning, adapted behaviour, which helps us to gain occupations and build our well-being and self-esteem. So if there is a difficulty with your sensory processing, it could have an effect on other skills too. So now we have taken a look at the 8 senses, let's take a moment to think about how you already support your child's sensory development. How do you help them develop their sense of taste or touch? And think about the new senses, particularly vestibular and proprioception. What activities do you support and encourage that might help development of these? Think about how you play with your child, or the types of activities that you do together. Think about what senses are stimulated through these activities. You might want to pause the video to write these down. We have identified our 8 senses and established that we all receive and process information from these senses every day. We are now going to help you understand sensory processing and begin to take a look at what sensory processing difficulties might look like. I want you to think about a cup. This represents your ability to take in and manage sensory information. Throughout your day, you receive sensory information: the sound of your alarm, the smell of your morning coffee, the feel of the rain outside. All of these bits of sensory information begin to fill up your cup. Not too much, but just enough that you are registering and responding appropriately to what you need to. Now I want you to imagine a much smaller cup and that same sensory information. The same sensory information is received by the individual with a small cup. However, the cup quickly becomes full, resulting in a feeling of being overwhelmed and unable to cope with the world. Finally, I want you to imagine a much bigger cup than the first. Again, this individual receives the same sensory information, except in this case the information is barely registered in such a large cup, resulting in a lack of response. An individual with a small cup is referred to as over-responsive. They are quick to over-respond to sensory input. An individual with a large cup is referred to as under-responsive. they under-respond to sensory input. There are some behaviours that we see in over-responsiveness and under-responsiveness. A child who has a small cup and over-responds to sensory input can respond with fight, flight, or freeze depending on the situation. A child who has a large cup and is under-responsive will either be passive and seemingly unaffected by the input, that is, they are barely registering it, and so they are unaware that there is something to respond to, or they will seek more sensory input from the environment. Their nervous system knows that it's not getting enough information, and so it drives the child to find a way of gaining more. This is sometimes referred to as sensory-seeking behaviour. All of our senses are interlinked and have an impact on each other. It can help to think about whether you have different sized cups for different senses. For example, you may have a small cup, that is, you are over-responsive, for vision, hearing, touch and smell information. But then you have a big cup, meaning you are under-responsive, for vestibular, taste, proprioception and interoception. So, with this in mind, the next step is to think about the variations we see throughout the day. Nobody is the same all of the time. There are typical variations due to what's going on in your environment, how you are feeling about the skills you have to do the tasks, and what the occupation is that you're trying to do. Is it at the just right level for you? For example, take a moment to think about how you might respond to sensory information differently when you are unwell, when you are in a crowded environment, or when you are trying to do a new, difficult task. Ideally, we want to be in a position where we can manage all of our sensory input adequately enough to go about our day. When looking at children, we often call this the ready-to-learn state. So those that are over-responsive we looked at earlier are up here, and those who under-respond are down here. Some children, however, swing from one extreme to another, and this is known as sensory modulation difficulties. Often, by intervening, we are aiming to provide the appropriate activities to either reduce or increase sensory input, to help a child stay within the ready-to-learn state. I suggest you now pause the video and take a break to consider what we have covered so far. Have a think about the questions on screen and then continue with the video. Which senses do you feel you have a small cup for? What do you do to help yourself cope with this small cup? Which senses do you feel you have a large cup for? Do you feel you have a large cup because it doesn't bother you, or because you seek more of it? In the second half of this training, we are going to look at how we break down sensory processing difficulties and how we might be able to help. If we go back to consider the PEO diagram from the start of the training, we start by considering which occupation is being affected. What is it that the child wants to do, has to do, or needs to do that they can't? We then look at all the areas, child, environment and occupations, to see what can be changed to help. Changes within the child can be limited by their age and learning, but regardless of the child's potential to change, us having an understanding of the different way a child processes sensory information helps us understand the child, communicate their needs to those around them, and provide the right opportunities for the child to learn and gain occupational skills. However, there are many changes that we can start to make in the child's environment and in how the occupation is presented to help the child participate and learn. So, how do you know it's a problem? Well, we usually see a child playing and behaving differently. So before we start considering how sensory behaviours present, let's think about what typical behavioural responses look like. Behaviour can be a complex area and one we may work with a psychologist to explore. However, there are some basic ideas it is worth thinking about. Whether we are considering a sensory behaviour or not, the key is to try and understand why something is happening. We can easily jump ahead to what we think might help, but two children can be behaving in the same way for very different reasons. It is worth stopping to think about whether your child is using their behaviour to get something, to avoid something, to get stimulation or relieve boredom, or to express or manage feelings such as confusion or pain. A number of children can struggle with anxiety. Unfortunately, the tendency for both anxiety and sensory over-responsiveness to trigger the fight, flight, or freeze response creates a cycle. Fight, flight, or freeze is a response that our nervous system can have to a perceived threat. For example, if you are scared by something, you may stand still or freeze. If you are angry about something, you may lash out or fight. If something scares you, you may run away. The fight, flight, and freeze response can be triggered by both sensory over-responsiveness and anxiety. So, for example, a child is anxious about attending school because they have some difficulties with social communication. This increases their anxiety, especially during break times. This anxiety causes them to lash out, run away, or hide. This activation of the fight, flight, and freeze response means they are less able to cope with the noise and busyness of the playground. They become even more over-responsive to sensory input. This over-responsiveness to sensory input also activates the fight, flight, or freeze response. All this increases their anxiety further, continuing the vicious cycle. You may have heard of the concept of a behavioural volcano. This is an illustration to help us examine a behavioural incident and highlight what could be done differently in the future. The child starts at baseline. Something happens to move them off baseline and they start to escalate. It's at this point that their tolerance is lowered to other triggers, including sensory ones. So sensory input that they are normally able to cope with may suddenly become too much for them at that point. As they begin to escalate, moving up the volcano, anxiety and sensory overload can start playing a part. It is here that strategies need to be used, as once the child is at stage 5, managing to take on support will be near impossible. At stage 5, the aim is to keep the child safe and help de-escalate their fight, flight, or freeze response. After the incident, the child will need space and help to refocus as they return to baseline. If you are introducing new activities or strategies designed to help a child manage their behaviour, this needs to be done when the child is at baseline, when they can focus on learning something new. Take a moment to have a look at the volcano and see if you can think of an incident with your child where, looking back, you can identify these stages. As well as considering behaviour, it's important to stop and think about what else might be going on that's impacting your child's behaviour. Think about an iceberg. Only a small percentage of its mass is visible above the water. There is much more of it beneath the surface. In the same way, we may be focused on the behaviour we can see above the water, but there is much more going on below the surface to contribute to this, and some of it won't necessarily be sensory based. Now that we have considered what else might be impacting a child's behaviour, let's move on to what we can do to help. I'm going to give you some general strategies grouped into the areas of environment, occupation, and child. Within each of these areas, we are also going to look at some example case studies to apply some of the strategies to a situation. Within each case study, I will also give you some red flags, which are things to look out for, and in that situation, seek more support from either your GP, paediatrician, or involved health teams such as occupational therapy. Starting with environment. The aim here is to adapt or enhance the environment to help the child manage their sensory differences and optimise their engagement in occupational tasks. Here are some general suggestions for changes to the environment that might help children with sensory difficulties. Provide a calming, safe space the child can access, such as a pop-up tent or box filled with cushions. Add more visual cues in the environment to support the child's understanding. Try using different environments with less people and therefore noise. Think about other distractions such as smell, visual displays, and the noise of equipment in the room. If doing tasks at a table, make sure the table and chair are at a good height, so the child is well supported with their bottom back and feet supported. Make those supporting the child aware of their difficulties so they can respond appropriately. This is Billy. He is a busy little boy who loves climbing, running and spinning. He doesn't like having to sit down at meal times. Billy seems to be under-responsive to vestibular and proprioceptive input. He has a large cup for these types of sensory input. Here are some strategies we might suggest for Billy. Build regular movement breaks into his day, but make sure it's clear when they start and end so that he is still accessing the other activities he needs to do. Where possible, build movement and changes of position into the tasks he needs to do. Give lots of opportunities for calming, organising, linear movement that we discussed earlier, rather than him always having alerting rotational movement like spinning. The red flags where you may need to seek further support, in Billy's case, are high level of risk-taking behaviours and potentially injuring himself, climbing over things and escaping, hanging upside down and/or spinning excessively. This is Hermione. She doesn't like busy, noisy places and often puts her hands over her ears. Hermione seems to be over-responsive to sound. She has a small cup. Here are some strategies we might suggest for Hermione. Provide a sensory retreat space where she can go to reduce the stimulation. Try using headphones with music or white noise or ear defenders to reduce the noise level to allow her to access activities, but not all of the time. Do things in small groups or one-to-one where possible. Try to go to places at quieter times. The red flags in Hermione's case are running away and escaping, hiding, severe levels of distress. Next, the occupation. The aim here is to adapt or enhance the child's access to an occupation and to provide the child with the just right challenge. Here are some general suggestions for changing the task that might help children with sensory difficulties. Use a child's interests as much as possible to make the activities attractive. Give a child choice where possible. Make sure the start and finish of the tasks are clear, especially if it's something the child doesn't want to do. Break down tasks using visuals as appropriate and try reward charts. Use backward chaining to teach a task that has several steps. Backward chaining is a technique that teaches the last step of an activity first. By finishing the task, the child gets a sense of achievement. Reduce the amount of sensory input a task gives, such as painting with brushes instead of hands, or dressing with soft clothing. Increase the amount of sensory input a task gives, such as colouring with sandpaper beneath the paper, or using a rough towel to dry after the bath. This is Eva. She loves playing in the sandpit, but she struggles to take turns. She often asks an adult to help her with her coat, and doesn't show any awareness of the daily routine. Eva presents with some learning difficulties and communication delays. Here are some strategies we might suggest for Eva. Use backward chaining to teach her how to manage her coat, where you teach her the last step first so she achieves success. Use the now and next strategy to increase the number of things she is accessing. For example, now sandpit, next colouring. Give her tasks in bite-sized chunks so she only needs to concentrate on a task for a short time. Encourage more variety in the occupations she's engaging in to increase her occupational balance. The red flags in Eva's case are a continued lack of progress, a continued poor balance of occupations. Finally, the child. The aims here are to help the child manage their sensory differences, provide the right opportunities for the child to gain new sensory experiences, and respond to these by increasing their engagement in day-to-day occupations. Here are some general suggestions for what we can do with the child that might help their sensory difficulties. Keep in mind the child's age and, more importantly, developmental stage. Focus on what they need to achieve next, not what they should be doing at their age. Think about what you like and admire about the child's strengths, and try to build on this. Keep the child at the centre, being mindful of what's important to them and for them. Think about where the child is and what they want to do. Be clear on what realistic success looks like. Help the child experience activities they struggle with in a controlled and understanding way by reducing the environmental demands and providing familiar and trusted people to help the child engage in the occupation. Where possible, let the child lead in sensory activities so that they can start and stop as needed, but make sure the child has opportunities and encouragement to move on to new sensory experiences. This is Charlie. Charlie doesn't like messy play and is always keen to wash their hands during messy activities. Charlie seems to be over-responsive to touch sensations. Charlie appears to have a small cup. Here are some strategies we might suggest for Charlie. Help them to experience messy activities in a controlled, graded way. Start with substances inside clear plastic bags so they can be explored without getting messy. Use tools such as paintbrushes, cutlery, sandpit tools to explore messy textures. Build up to difficult textures like wet and sticky slowly and let the child stop when they want. The red flags in Charlie's case are very restricted diet, severe distress with messy tasks, for example vomiting or gagging. This is Zane. He chews on lots of different things and chews on toys rather than playing with them often. Zane may be under-responsive. He has a large cup. Here are some strategies we might suggest for Zane. Bear in mind that chewing is a developmental stage that can persist. Young children use their mouths to explore the world. Offer and encourage exploration with hands in new activities. Provide stimulating food options such as raw fruit and veg. Vibrating toys held against the mouth or ears can give a similar feeling as chewing. Let the child place them where they want, with close supervision. Provide chewies or jewellery to allow safe chewing. The red flags in Zane's case are eating non-food objects, putting unsafe objects in his mouth very regularly. In summary, think about what it is that your child wants to do, needs to do, or has to do that is affected or prevented due to sensory differences. Keep in mind that unfortunately there are very few quick fixes for sensory difficulties. Give yourself time. When you try sensory strategies, they won't necessarily work the first time. Make sure the environment is right and try strategies at different times of day and on more than one occasion. Find ways to help your child express how they are feeling, or try and spot when their behaviour is escalating and they are starting to feel or look out of control, in fight or flight. Try and use strategies as soon as you spot the difference. Offer a variety of sensory activities little and often during the child's day to support a ready-to-learn state. Remember, you are looking for progress towards your shared goal with your child, not perfection. Thank you for listening. We hope this training video has been helpful and we would value your feedback. If you have any comments or questions about this video, please contact us on 02921 836 910 836 910.